We'll be getting into talking about a new subject today, which is the conquest of America, which, starts right after, I guess, Columbus, discovers parts of the New World. You've got the, conquistadors that kind of follow on the heels of Columbus in his expeditions, and others, I guess, that Europeans that come after that as well. So we'll talk about that, really a two-part lecture series today, and I'll get into also a second part of that later on Wednesday, later in the week. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the background of the conquistadors first. I'll kind of get into them, and I'll kind of go into all the different ones that were kind of well known in history. Of course, the two you see in there in that particular picture, of course, you've got Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro. Those are really the two most famous of the conquistadors. They were really the most successful. Everybody kind of heard of Hernan Cortes, I'm sure. Sometimes called Hernando, but he preferred Hernan. Cortes, of course, conquered Mexico, as you know. And then Pizarro would go on to conquer part of South America, where Peru is as well. So those two ended up being, very, very famous as conquistadors in general. So they started arriving, really roughly, like I said, right after the heels of Columbus in the 1500s. And so, the whole conquistadors helped, like I said, spearhead, what becomes the colonization of the Americas, not just the Spanish, but Portuguese and others that, that come in afterwards. And of course, the term conquistador in Spanish means conqueror or conquerors. Maybe a translation of what it basically means. And conquers, and I'll talk about some of the earlier ones later. I'll get to Ponce de Leon, I guess, I think him and Balboa, I think were considered like some of the first of these conquistadors that arrived, but they weren't just conquerors, they were explorers, like exploring like new lands and all that they never seen before. And in the Americas for a long time, the Spanish called it the La Conquista, which means the conquest, simply. So that's what actually called it more than anything. And most of them were in search of riches. That's something I'll kind of go into today. Most of them are seeking, they're basically like soldiers of fortune that arrive from Spain into, of course, the New World. Hey, Michelle, good morning. And also looks like Julie is also joining us this morning as well. So if you're having a great time out there, okay. So I'll first talk about some of the things that, of course, that kind of influenced a lot of the conquistadors to seek these riches. The conquistadors kind of saw themselves as compadres. They often call themselves that, like companions. They were kind of in it more for the money than for, say, religion or even for the crown in Spain as a whole. Cortes summed it up best about, the conquest. It's a famous quote by Hernan Cortes that you may have heard of, but he said that we Spaniards know a sickness of the heart that only gold can cure. And so the thing that, that's mostly what they were, searching for. And a lot of men in Spain started seeing all this gold, flooding into the country from the Americas. And so they wanted to obviously join these adventures in the New World. And so that's why a lot of people left, of course, later to go there. Later, of course, create like a big colonial boom too, like people leaving, Spain to also go to the Americas after that. They were backed up, by the way, by the ruler of Spain, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles, King Charles or Emperor Charles V, as they called it. And so he's the one that kind of helps start the whole conquest of the Americas at that point. And Charles, by the way, was one of the greatest rulers in the 16th century. He, of course, controlled vast amounts of land, which I'll kind of talk about in Europe and, of course, in the Americas and all that. Looks like Sophie's also joining us this morning also as well. So we're having a great morning out there as well. Also, another thing I wanted to talk about the conquistadors, a lot of them were influenced by legends that were kind of well known. You may have heard the story about El Dorado, like the lost city of gold. This was a famous legend that was kind of being passed around in the Americas. And there was this belief that there was some kind of king that uh, ruled over some kind of city of gold where they had like gold all over the place. And I think even the Spanish thought that there were gold in the streets. And you literally pick the gold off of the buildings and stuff like that. El Dorado actually means in Spanish, it means either the golden man or the gilded man. I'll use the translation of it. And actually, it was the nickname of the king that ruled it, not the actual city itself. But a lot of the Spanish believed it. I think they seem to think that this El Dorado was somewhere in South America. I think some people believe the Inca Empire maybe was one of the things that inspired it. Like maybe the Inca rulers themselves were kind of seen as the El Dorado that they're kind of talking about. They even had Spanish that tried to find El Dorado. Of course, Pizarro, would go into South America, Peru, and find the Inca Empire. So that's one example. Also, they had this man named Francisco de Orellana, who was a famous conquistador and explorer. He actually went into the Amazon region, Amazon jungle and Amazon River, exploring it in the 1540s, thinking that El Dorado was there as well. And of course, didn't find it, but he was one of the first Europeans to explore the Amazon River and its tributaries that are part of South America, today. And I think there was also, Sir Walter Raleigh. Yeah, Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1590s even searched for El Dorado as well. So there was that case also as well. They also had this other legend that was well known called, you may have heard of the seven cities of Cibola. It's kind of well known, which was this legend. There was these seven gold cities that were existing somewhere in the Americas. And I think Francisco de Coronado searched for it. If you know about this in North America, like in Arizona, New Mexico, I think he even tried to explore the Great Plains all the way to Kansas, try to find it. And it's showed up in movies. Like I think it was a Nicolas Cage movie you may have seen before called National Treasury 2, Book of Secrets, where they kind of, I guess he discovers it or whatever. So it's kind of this story that's kind of circulating, that there's gold that you can find, in the Americas. And so that's something that really spurred on a lot of these conquistadors to come into the Americas and all that. Looks like Connor's joining us also this morning as well. Hope you're having a great week overall. So I'm going to move on and I'm going to talk about some of the conquistadors that first came in to the Americas. I want to first talk about Juan Ponce de Leon. He's really one of the first that you really hear about that comes into the Americas as a whole. Yeah, Juan Ponce de Leon. He's really one of the first to explore really part of America at that point. Juan Ponce de Leon, if you know a little bit about him, he originally came to the Americas with Columbus. He was on Columbus's second voyage to the Americas. Anyway, he ended up in Puerto Rico. In fact, he was involved in the conquest of Puerto Rico. He was like a governor of the island. And he heard about this story about the so-called Fountain of Youth, if you may have heard about before. But he first gained fame for really, conquering Puerto Rico in general. And then because of the Fountain of Youth story, he decided to take an expedition up north, like north of basically Puerto Rico, I guess close to where the Bahamas is today. And so the thing that's famous about, Ponce de Leon, he became one of the first Europeans to discover what is now Florida. Today, what you see in that map right there. And of course, the whole Fountain of Youth story, they think that's probably a story where I think that there's kind of different theories about where it came from, the Fountain of Youth. But they think that it was something that went back to Europe, maybe influenced by possibly the story of Prester John. I think in the Prester John story, there's some kind of story about some kind of river of gold that existed. And then you have also the Holy Grail story you've heard about, where if you drank from the Grail, it would, give you eternal youth. And so they think that's maybe possibly where that story came from. But they actually think that he was really searching for probably gold and obviously new lands that the Spanish could conquer and obviously colonize later. And so that's primarily what the Ponce de Leon expedition was for. So Ponce de Leon would actually explore. He explored Florida twice, 1513 and 1519. In 1519, he was actually killed on the second expedition in Florida by Native Americans that were there. I think he was shot by an arrow and died right after. So yeah, Ponce de Leon, he had him. Then they had Vasco de Balboa, of course, was another famous explorer and conquistador that was also involved too in some expeditions as well. There's Balboa, a picture of him right there. You see Panama, of course, they talked about in that short video right there. Balboa is mostly known for discovering the Pacific Ocean, which, of course, they talked about the fact that he discovered it in September of 500. Now it's 508 years ago. I think that video is a little old, but 508 years ago to this month, of course, is when he discovered what would be the Pacific Ocean. He arrived there right in the year 1513, they believe. I think he was a stowaway on a ship, believe it or not. And anyway, he gets to Panama, just now was later part of Colombia, then broke off later, about that in the early 20th century. But mostly they were searching for gold, which, by the way, Balboa was one of the first to actually find gold riches in the New World. And he took about almost 200 men. They decided they were going to, apparently the natives had told him about some kind of sea that was to the south. And so he took some men and he decided to cross over what would be now the Isthmus of Panama, as they call it today. And he arrived there, of course, they say September 25th, 1513. And of course, he sees the Pacific Ocean. And so, as you know, Balboa becomes the first European to, see the Pacific Ocean in general. However, if you remember correctly, they talked about in the video, little short video, how they didn't call it Pacific Ocean. That was a term, if you remember correctly, that Magellan coined later, like around 1520, I guess it is, when he coined it. He called it the South Sea. Or I think, or the actual name is, if you want, I think it's Mar del Sur, or something like that, Sea of the South. And so that's the name. South Sea or South Seas was a common name they often called the Pacific Ocean after that. So that's what Balboa's, known for today, for his discovery of the Pacific Ocean, which turns out to be, like they said in the video, one of the most vast oceans we have, of course, in the world. Joshua, hey, good morning, also as well. And Jasmine also is joining us as well. So yeah, Balboa. Let me move on also to this other explorer that you may have heard of before, named Pánfilo de Narvaez. He was another conquistador who came to the Americas in the 1520s. And it was called the Narvaez expedition, which, by the way, involved like 600 conquistadors. One of the largest expeditions, I guess, into the Americas at that point. In the point of the expedition, by the way, was to explore America, North America, which the Spanish called it Florida, they call it at the time. And I think they believed the Spanish were going to basically try to not just go in there and conquer it, they were going to try to colonize it. It's one of the things they were going to try to do. Here's kind of a bigger picture of there's Pánfilo de Narvaez. Narvaez, by the way, was a conquistador that had helped Cortes conquer Mexico. So he was involved in Mexico right before that. And so he was sent there to try to conquer it. However, the expedition, if you know about it, turned out to be a disaster. As they were sailing up into the Gulf of Mexico, they believed that their whole fleet was wiped out by a storm, which likely was a hurricane, they think. And they had reached where the Bay of Horses is, which is in Tampa Bay, Florida, now today. And they call it the Bay of Horses, by the way, because apparently they lost all the horses drowned in the bay. It's kind of bad because they need their horses in the Americas. And hence the name of the bay now called that. And so most of the men were actually killed, is what ended up happening. Well, very few of them survived. And supposedly there were like 4 men that survived. If you know about it, 4 out of the 600 men actually lived. That's it. It's crazy. And they were enslaved by the Native Americans, like Indians enslaved them, which they were enslaved, I think, for a few years under them. And there was one man that was very famous named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. He survived. He was one of the men that survived. And Cabeza de Vaca was a nickname that meant head of a cow. And here's kind of a map showing you the route of the expedition. So initially they came up through where Hispaniola and Cuba is, you can see here. And then they were going to sail up to Florida here. And their fleet got wiped out. But some of the men were able to survive all the way over here where Galveston is. I think they ended up on Galveston Island over here. But most of the men got enslaved and only 4 survived at that point. From Texas, which is true, the men then walked on foot. Texas, I think, into, I want to say, where New Mexico is over here. And they went down into Mexico. And took them years, but about 1536, they were found by other conquistadors in Mexico. What's funny is a lot of them spoke the actual Native American languages because they had learned, I guess, their languages because they had been enslaved by them and all. They met all these natives. And so a lot of the conquistadors thought the survivors were Indians when they met them. Crazy, huh? About that. And Cabeza de Vaca wrote a book about his adventures. There's different names it's called today, which here it is right there. So we call it The Adventures of Cabeza de Vaca. Originally, it was actually called The Account. Is what it's actually named, or I guess if you want the Spanish, La Relation. I guess is that way I say it, I guess, in Spanish. That's basically the famous book that he wrote about his adventures. And it is a very interesting book, by the way. It's really kind of like a proto-anthropological type work because he's kind of describing all the different Native Americans that he kind of encountered on his journeys. So he's like one of the first to really kind of describe the cultures of basically Native American peoples, indigenous peoples that are living in North America. So it's interesting about that, about Cabeza de Vaca. They do think de Vaca influenced other explorers later. Like they think he influenced the Soto to come back and explore, and also Coronado as well. And I think there's a theory that de Vaca may have influenced the whole Lost Cities of Gold story that was circulating because de Vaca claimed in some of his stories that he saw Native American type structures that had like a gold roof on them, like the whole Cibola belief, Lost Cities of Gold. Actually, when I was in Mexico one time, they showed me how some of the natives would build their structures out of obsidian. It's like a black volcanic stone. And when the sun shines on it, it actually looks gold. It's interesting about that. So maybe that's why they got fooled by that or what. So that's Cabeza de Vaca and his adventures and all that into the interior of the Americas at that point. And so that influences a lot of people. You can see a statue, by the way, here in this picture right here. That's actually in Houston, I think where that statue is, like in a park there. And they think he's like probably up in that area where Houston, Galveston areas where he kind of came ashore, I guess, around there. All right, so talk about de Vaca and all that. Let me also move on and talk about a few other explorers that were also well known. Now, they had another famous explorer that came to the Americas, which is Hernando de Soto. And He also was one of the first to come into the Americas as well and explore it. De Soto had been famous before this. This kind of occurs around 1540, but Soto goes back to the 1520s. He was an old conquistador that had been around. It's a bunch of things he did. De Soto, I've got up here for you. One of the first things he was involved in the conquest of the Yucatan, close around the 1520s. Cordoba as well. Francisco Cordoba, he was a famous conquistador that had gone into Nicaragua. He had helped him conquer parts of Central America as well. Oh, also De Soto was involved with the conquest of Peru, the Inca Empire. He aided Francisco Pizarro. He was very close with him as well. So this guy, Hernando de Soto had been around. He'd been involved in a lot of conquests. I think he was pretty wealthy too from some of the conquests he had been involved in. And so he kind of continued what was, I guess, Narvaez was trying to do with his previous expedition that had failed at that point. So yeah, born 1496 or around that time is about when De Soto was born. And his expedition lasted about 2-3 years. It involved close to 600 men that eventually landed where Florida is today. And they believe his expedition went up through close to where I think where basically central Florida is about today. And anyway, I've got a map showing you about his expedition's journey. That's the so-called proposed route that he supposedly took as he went through multiple states. He is one of the first major conquistadors that explored really, I guess, into the interior of like the Gulf, this Gulf South, that the area that the Gulf of Mexico, the United States, and what would be the southeastern parts of the United States today, as we call it overall. So yeah, he obviously explored part of Florida. It's like central Florida predominantly, but you can see he went up through into Georgia as well. Yeah, Georgia. They think he went to North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, down into also Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Arkansas, Texas as well. Some of his men did go into Texas. There's a theory they went into Louisiana, but they're not sure about that if De Soto went that far. There had been a debate about where he died. I know that has been one theory as well. Some of his men, I think, also came down the river, you can see, into Louisiana later, but I think he died before he got there overall. They think near Memphis, which there's now a famous bridge there called the Hernando de Soto Bridge, crossing over there, you can see, into Memphis, Tennessee. That's where they think De Soto crossed the actual Mississippi River and discovered it. So he's like one of the first Europeans that really finds it. They don't think the Narvaez expedition actually, I don't know, they kind of skirted it or whatever, but didn't really find the bulk of the river like De Soto would. And I think at the time it was flooded, the river, when he found it, because I think in some of his, I guess, diary accounts or whatever about his expedition, he talks about how wide the river was, because it evidently had flooded its banks and all that, which back then the river did because, there were no levees back then. But these are all the different, like I said, the different, states that he went into at one point. And I think they say as far west as Texas that he went to was where Nacogdoches is. Where that city is in the eastern part of Texas, more or less. So that's a large, area that he explored, at one point. What happened with De Soto, apparently he died somewhere in the eastern part of Arkansas, like I want to say southeastern Arkansas, and was buried in the river in 1542. It's believed they did this because of the fact that apparently the Spanish, when they were exploring the Americas, they wanted the natives to think that they were gods. And so I think they told that De Soto was some kind of god or something like that, and so they didn't want him to know that he had died. Otherwise, that would be kind of bad for them. And so that's why basically, they did that. They guess secretly to kind of not know what happened to him. So yeah, that we'll talk about it later, but they think that De Soto wasn't just searching for gold. They think that was one thing, sure, but they do think that he was. There's a theory that De Soto was searching for some kind of passage to the Pacific Ocean. I think that's what they maybe thought that possibly the Mississippi River might be. There might be some kind of passage that would take him to like Asia or something like that. And so they think that was another theory about why they're exploring the Americas, not just colonization or gold, but that as well. They do think that a lot of these explorations into the New World, it's going to result in the Spanish trying to colonize that part of North America, especially like Florida in that area. And that'll lead to eventually St. Augustine, the city of St. Augustine, being founded in Florida on the East Coast, kind of close to Jacksonville on the Atlantic in September of 1565. That's going to be really considered to be one of the oldest European cities founded in the Americas, especially in North America. I think the other one I told you was Santo Domingo. It had been founded before, by the Spanish, where the Dominican Republic is now today. And so that was something that the Spanish would do within so many years after De Soto came. Right, let me also move on, and I'm going to talk about as well another famous conquistador who followed De Soto as well, kind of around the same time as De Soto, and that is Francisco de Coronado. He's kind of known for being very famous as well. Who was Coronado? Coronado was this conquistador who was also a governor that had taken over a kind of an area in northern Mexico called New Galicia. He was like a governor or viceroy of it. And when he was in northern Mexico, he heard about some kind of legend about the so-called lost cities of gold, which we talked about was called Cibola. And like I said, I told you this story likely was something that was influenced by the whole Cabeza de Vaca adventures, up in North America there. And so Coronado thought that that's where it was. That's got to be where Cibola is. And so he took a huge expedition of men, which involved, you can see, several hundred Spanish soldiers, over 1,000 Native American Indians were also involved as well as he explored that area. I do have a map showing the route that Coronado took on his expeditions. So he started in northern Mexico, came up through here, but some of his men also went into the Gulf of California, which, by the way, the Gulf of California had been originally been discovered by Cortes years before, after his conquest of Mexico. Anyway, we can see the main route they took up was through northern Mexico, in where the San Pedro River Valley is right here in Arizona. So you see the route he's going right here. And as they get into like Arizona and New Mexico, Coronado believes that some of the Native American Indians, like especially the Zuni Pueblo Indians, he thought they were associated with the whole Cibola legend, that their villages were basically that. And if you know about the Pueblo Indians, they were famous living in these huts, these kind of mud huts that they lived in. Kind of call it Pueblo hut, I guess, as they call it sometimes. Anyway, he thought some of them were like that. And apparently there was this Indian guy that he found that the Spanish, I think the Spanish called the Turk. You hear about the Turk, maybe. The Turk kept telling him like where Cibola was. And he said it was to the east somewhere. And so the Turk took Coronado's expedition eastward into like New Mexico. And then you can see in the map, they went also into parts of northern Texas and Oklahoma, and got as far as what is Kansas. And the other name they often call it too is Quivira, Cibola y Quivira, which of course is named after some kind of Native American village that Coronado discovered in the spring of 1541. Right here in this map right here, Kansas right here, close to where the Kansas River is up in here. And but he was kind of disappointed. He didn't find any gold on this whole expedition, into that part of North America. But, Coronado is considered one of the first to really, search parts of what we now call the American West today, the so-called Great Plains, etc., that they call it. Now, there is one thing that Coronado's men were known for. Of course, you may have heard about the Grand Canyon, right? That's something that's very, very famous, of course, in the West. I don't know if you've ever seen the Grand Canyon. I've seen it several times before. But they do think that in 1540, it was discovered by one of his men, Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, found it. And it was part, as you know, the Colorado River Basin today. Believe it or not, most of the Spanish weren't really impressed by it. Yes, I think he was, Cardenas. Some of his writings, I think they saw it later. They weren't impressed because the fact that they couldn't find any gold, that kind of thing. But of course, a lot of people later would come and see how beautiful it is, of course, today. You can see the Colorado River there, right there, that picture. But it's amazing how millions of years ago that was all carved out, by water a long time ago. But so, yeah, so that's one thing Coronado is known for, is being one of the first to discover parts of the Grand Canyon, of course, today. It's a big tourist attraction, as you know, national park in the West. All right, I got a few minutes left. I want to also talk about one more conquistador today that's, of course, very well known, probably one of the most famous overall that we'll get to. And that is Hernan Cortes, the famous conquistador, swashbuckling guy, I guess you can call him also as well. He would conquer, of course, Mexico in the Aztec Empire. So we'll kind of talk about him today, a little bit about Cortes and what he was kind of known for. Cortes, by the way, believe it or not, was not a professional soldier. He's known for his, like I said, his conquest of Mexico and the Aztecs in the 1520s. But Cortes himself was actually a law student. He was in school at the time. In fact, he was eventually a trained notary as well. He heard about, the expeditions of all these people going to the Americas and seeing gold coming into Spain as well. And so Cortes wanted to get a piece of the action, what was going on in the New World. And so he left in the early 1500s for the Caribbean. And so he ended up, I think, in Hispaniola originally, and then later in Cuba, where he became an encomiendero, earning basically getting land there and using some of the Indians to basically, grow crops or whatever and control the land. I think he was a paid notary too. He was known for doing stuff like that as well. And what happened was he heard about Mexico. And so he got together this expedition in 1519 with about 200 something men. Not that many men were involved in it initially. And he would enter the Yucatan Peninsula. He actually pretty much paid for the expedition himself, like got the ships and men all involved on this expedition to invade Mexico, which people thought he was crazy to try to conquer Mexico at the time. And so he entered there first into part of Mexico. And when he was in the Yucatan, he acquired this important Maya woman named, well, they called her Donna Maria. Donna Marina was her name that the Spanish called her initially. But she was this slave girl. He had acquired a bunch of slave girls, I know, but they called her Donna Marina, or the other name was Malinson. Well, was the other name, but the Spanish actually called her La Malinche, which I believe translated as meaning the captain's wife or something like that, or mistress. And she would actually become basically a lover of Cortes. In fact, she actually had one son with him named Martin. Martin Cortes, who was considered one of the first mestizos that's born. But she knew what they called Nahuatl, which Nahuatl was the language of the Aztecs. And so she would be kind of important in helping to, be a kind of like a translator for Cortes. But they think she helped Cortes conquer Mexico because basically Cortes could understand their language and all that, which gave him kind of an edge against them. Besides that, I'll get more into it later. I'll kind of show you a video later, I think probably in the part 2 lecture later, but the Spanish had such an advantage going into the Americas. I mean, they had gunpowder, they had cannon, they had early muskets, they had crossbows and armor, Toledo steel, horses. All these, of course, gave them an advantage in the conquest in parts of the New World, especially in Latin America. They fought the Incas and of course, the Aztecs. And so these all helped to kind of, make it so easy for the Spanish to come in. And of course, they brought all these European diseases with them that we talked about before that also helped kill a lot of them, kill a lot of Native Americans off as well. So that's the only thing about that. So one of the things I'll kind of talk about is like how he gets into central Mexico, which I've got a map showing you the route of Hernan Cortes and his expedition, which is right here. And you can see there, he actually founds Veracruz, the city of Veracruz, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, eastern side of Mexico. From there, he pushes westward using some native allies that kind of join up with him that don't like the Aztecs. And so they push into central Mexico, or the so-called Valley of Mexico. And basically, he was going toward what is the capital of the Aztec Empire, which, of course, is the also called Tenochtitlan, which is now what we call modern Mexico City. What was the Aztec Empire? The Aztec Empire was this Native American confederation which had ruled since going back to the 15th century, like close to maybe the 1420s. They ruled parts of the Valley of Mexico, and it was a confederation of various tribes that controlled land around where that lake is, Lake Texcoco, which is where Mexico City will be built later. They were called different names. They were called the Nahuatl or Mexica, common name, or some people called Azteca, which I think the Spanish called them as well. And Nahuatl is a language, by the way, which has given us different words that we know today, like the word avocado, chili, chipotle, chocolate, addle, throwing spear, the word coyote, like the coyote, the animal, tomato also as well. Those are all words that come from the Aztecs from a long time ago. Looks like Amber's joining us also this morning. Hope you're having a great time out there as well. And anyway, there was, of course, I've got pictures showing, by the way, Tenochtitlan of what they think it looked like. Like I said, it was in the middle of a lake, Lake Texcoco, and had these causeways that ran to it, which they think that the city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, had, I think, several 100,000 that may have lived there at one point at the time. It was considered a pretty amazing city, one of the most advanced cities in the Americas at the time. Had these huge temples that were in the middle, which they used those to worship some of their gods. And of course, Cortes was disgusted with their culture because of the fact that they practice human sacrifice. If you know something, a lot of these indigenous peoples practice like the Maya Aztecs did and all that. And the current ruler of the Aztecs was a man named Montezuma or Moctezuma. He's pronounced either way. It's fine. Usually usually it's Moctezuma II. They called him. He was one of their last rulers, emperor of Mexico. And Montezuma thought that Cortes was a god, the god Quetzalcoatl, which was a type of famous Aztec god, often called the feather serpent god. And the Aztecs had this belief that this god had been exiled from Mexico and will return one day. And he was believed to have a beard. He had a chalky white face to himself. And they thought Montezuma thought the Cortes was that particular god. And so what ended up happening when Cortes met Montezuma in Tenochtitlan, which, by the way, happened on November 8th, they think 1519. He didn't want to kill him. He could have. You get so many troops, he could have just, warriors that could have killed Cortes at that point. And so he decided to put him up at his palace. Hospitality, the god Quetzalcoatl, that's him, basically. And, of course, as you know, Cortes is going to take advantage of that and basically seize control of the Aztec Empire. There have been, of course, a lot of paintings that have been made depicting the two meeting. Here's, of course, one right here. Here's a more wider picture of where they met, which they met in a hospital. Now, I think it's called the Hospital de Jesus, which is in Mexico City, in the central part of the city now today. It's actually the spot of where it is now. That's a very famous painting of the two. So you got the old world meeting the new world at that point. And but right after this happens, what occurs is that Cortes basically seizes Montezuma, basically arrests him and says, hey, if you don't do what we say, I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to kill you, shoot you in the head or whatever with a pistol, basically. And so basically Montezuma becomes like a puppet of Cortes. Now, the Aztecs, after several months, they realized that Montezuma is not the same ruler that he was initially. And so the Aztecs eventually, they revolted. They revolted against Montezuma, actually killing him. I think either stoned him or shot him with arrows. And he died. And so at that point, Cortes and his men were forced to flee the capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, which they think happened on the night of June 30th, 1520, which the Spanish now call it La Noche Triste, which means the night of tears. I believe it was using one of the translations of it. And a lot of his men did not get out. A lot of them were actually captured by the Aztecs and killed. And so at that point, Cortes is forced to go on a mass retreat and flee the city. Otherwise, his forces would get wiped out at that point. So what happens is Cortes then, what he does, he retreats to this other Native American city nearby called Tlaxcala. And this was a group of Native Americans in central Mexico that supported Cortes because they hated the Aztecs. They couldn't stand them. And they realized that, I guess they saw the writing on the wall with the Europeans coming, that if they didn't do anything, I guess, to support them, that their whole culture would get wiped out. And so the Tlaxcalans supported Cortes with men. And so one of the things that Cortes did to try and take back Tenochtitlan, I told you how Tenochtitlan was basically like an island. It was like, middle of an island with bridges, causeways going to it, basically. And what Cortes came up with, which was pretty ingenious, he built a bunch of ships, like in the middle of like Mexico, and he dragged them by land, and he used ships to lay siege to the actual island, the capital of Tenochtitlan. And the siege went on for like 2.5 months. I think it lasted like 70, 80 days. It lasted 70, 80 days. And eventually what happened, of course, was that the Aztecs eventually capitulated in the fall. They call it the fall. Usually the fall of Tenochtitlan is usually what they call it, which happened in 1521 at that point. So after the fall of Tenochtitlan, what happened was Cortes then founded Mexico City. As you know, the actual city, the capital of Mexico, is built on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. It's there today. It's not a huge city, one of the largest cities in the Americas today, Mexico City. And it becomes later the capital of New Spain. New Spain will later be one of the first major colonies of the Spanish and the New World they have. And so that's basically something that Cortes is able to do at that point. Supposedly, that's why the Hospital de Gis was built, because Cortes felt guilty about, I think, what he had done with the conquest of Mexico. And so he built a hospital on the site where he and Montezuma met, which is interesting about that particular story. Yeah, it looks like Kayla's joining us also in StreamYard. So I hope you're having a good morning out there. So I'm glad you figured that out. Anyway, so that's the story of some of the early conquistadors. Now, I'm probably going to talk later. I don't think I'm going to have time to go into it today, but I'm going to also later talk about the other conquistador who you see right here. I'm going to get into and talk about Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro, is another famous conquistador, well known for his conquest of the Inca Empire. He might be actually one of the most ruthless of the conquistadors, I think more than Cortes was, because the fact that he killed so many indigenous peoples in his conquest of Peru today. So he's going to conquer that whole area you see there. And so that's going to lead to the Spanish expanding into South America and trying to colonize that area as well. And you have the Portuguese as well, doing the same thing at that point, because they take over Brazil and all that and colonize that. So I'm going to talk later in a part 2 lecture coming up in the week. I'm going to kind of talk more about that. And I'll get into the Americas, about all the different colonies that are set up and what happens to the indigenous peoples, what happens to them. And so we'll get into that and talk about kind of what happens after the aftermath of the conquistadors coming in. Before we go, I did want to just remind you about a few things about, I think I told you that if you forgot about it, that Canvas quiz number 2 on world exploration, that is, of course, our major assignment right now. You need to complete. And then, of course, don't forget, you've also got the first vocab assignment as well, which is later due this week as well. So that's our major assignments. Now, later, I probably will have some kind of quiz coming up, of course, on these 2-part lecture series on the conquistadors and the conquest of America. That'll be maybe later in the week, Wednesday or Friday, when I'll have that for you. So that's it for today for this particular lecture. I hope y'all have a great week after this, week 4. I think we got another hurricane out there or some kind of tropical storm that's kind of coming up through Mexico. What is it, Nicholas? Something like that. It's coming up. So it's like we got all kinds of stuff around here. So I guess that's what wiped out Narvaez expedition, that kind of thing. But I'll talk later more about the conquistadors. We'll get more into them in a part 2 lecture later on Wednesday. And I'll send out announcements about that coming up as well. So y'all take care. And I'll see you, of course, later in the week.